Thank you very much. I just have to, I think, no, that should be fine. Okay, can you see my presentation okay?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. So yes, as you said, this talk is actually a collaboration between Bjorn, me, and Jeremiah, who is in the audience and might interject and answer questions. So here what we are trying to do is really trying to be consistent with the spirit of the workshop, or at least how we understood it, and try to spark debate on what could be minimal requirements for scientific theories of consciousness. So very briefly, we start from the realization that I think there is a problem in consciousness science, and also like Camillo highlighted, theories of consciousness often have different goals and they focus on different aspects. Some theories are all about phenomenal consciousness, some focus more on access consciousness, or some other theories really just talk about some specific cognitive functions or report behavior, they try to find neural correlates of consciousness, etc. And we think this is a problem because there is disagreement. There is the situation is a spectrum of different definitions. And there is also a lack of consensus on the methods and tools that are allowed. So for instance, some theories try to use more introspection, some theories are more skeptical about it, some theories, of course, prefer some neuroscientific methods or interpret behavioral markers as being crucial, some other theories don't, etc. And in particular, we find that there is a lack of consensus on what we call the minimal requirements for a satisfactory theory of consciousness. So independently on the answers, on the solution that the theories propose, we think we should all agree on a set of questions, on a set of really just a checklist of explanations of facts or phenomena that a theory should be able to explain or address in order to be considered a satisfactory theory of consciousness. So our proposed solution, it's actually only the first step, I think, and it's very humble. It's to propose 7 minimal requirements that such a satisfactory theory should satisfy, covering both the goals, the methods, etc. So the aim is not to convince you that these requirements are the right ones, but it's just to foster discussion starting from an incomplete and a provisional list. And also just testing the consensus on the specific requirements and even just on the idea that we could, in principle, all agree on a list of minimal requirements. Background disclosure, of course, we are all working within the framework of IIT, so there are some of these questions can be basically, I think, are clearly questions that IIT itself tries to answer, but here we really are not concerned at all with the type of explanation a theory can use. We just want to focus on the questions. We want to know whether theories should all agree on the same set of questions. That's why it will not be about IIT at all, this talk. IIT free. So there has been, of course, earlier attempts. This is just a very, very short summary. Seth in 2006, and then Durig and Ali in 2021 had some criteria for theories of consciousness. Camille, of course, has this very nice way to compare theories, but what we would like to do here is not really compare theories or propose criteria to evaluate whether theories are good or bad, but it's really just, besides the explanation of specific theories, just focus on the questions that these theories should be addressing. So we're trying to start from scratch, and we are therefore asking ourselves, first of all, what a scientific theory should do in the first place. And here you can plug in your favorite philosophy of science theory, but in general, we think it's uncontroversial that theories, scientific theories, should explain the why of facts and empirical findings. They should provide organizing principles for understanding these observed phenomena. You should be able to generalize beyond data and make predictions for future research, and they should have clear and testable consequences and many other things. In particular, theories of consciousness, we think, should explain known facts about consciousness and its relation to the natural world. So, for instance, the purported, after Andres' talk, presence or absence of consciousness. why the brain seems to be relevant for consciousness but not the liver, for instance, why damage to occipital lobe alters visual phenomenology but damage to prefrontal cortex is more related with personality changes, why ketamine anesthesia leads to more vivid dreamlike states than a similar depth of anesthesia, for instance with propofol. And then a scientific theory of consciousness should also provide organizing principles for understanding observed phenomena, so give us a unified way to talk about it and to understand consciousness objectively in scientific terms, meaning from the third person, scientifically, with rigorous, measurable, intersubjective tools. And this is very important, and we think this is what, of course, could bring the community more, closely together in doing research on consciousness. And finally, we would hope a theory of consciousness should make testable predictions about where, when, and how consciousness occurs in the natural world. So why does it feel, whether it feels like something to be a patient with unresponsive wakeful syndrome. Of course, there's plenty of ethical implications that a theory of consciousness could help answer and disentangle. More philosophical questions such as what is like to be a bat, and what it be like to be a machine, or what would it take for a machine to be conscious, and so on. So this is just, I hope I haven't said anything controversial so far. Here, maybe the controversial part starts. We would like to present 7 minimal requirements. And the first one is that a theory, to be a satisfactory theory of consciousness, should be a scientific theory of consciousness. And this might seem a little circular, but I think it's not, because first of all, it should be a scientific theory, meaning it should use objective properties as the explanant, so the means through which the phenomenon is explained. And these properties should be measurable, intersubjective, they should be rigorous, they should be constant, they should reliably give results for similar experiments, and they should be, of course, consistent with other natural sciences. And in this case, we think that plenty of theories are trying to do exactly that. They are scientific theories. So, for instance, any theory that proposes a physical or cognitive or computational property or function of the substrate to explain consciousness is trying to be scientific. So we have active inference, cause-effect structures with IIT, global availability, higher-order representations, access consciousness. These are all things that more or less we can measure, and this is good. But it's important that this is, we think, the explanants of the theory. So what allows us to explain the phenomenon in a scientific way. But our theory should also be a scientific theory of consciousness, meaning, like Camillo started arguing, well, we need to agree on what we mean by consciousness. And we think that a full scientific theory of consciousness should be a theory of subjective experience. So the explanants can be objective, but the explanandum should really be subjective, what it is like to be a certain subject in a certain state, and not some objective correlate that comes with the experience, like neural markers or functions, which are crucial to explain the subjective experience, but they are not what we are explaining. And if you want to know a little bit more about this specific point, we just published a paper with other co-authors like Francesco Elia, first author, and Giulio Tononi, called Consciousness and the Fallacy of Misplaced Objectivity in Neuroscience of Consciousness, and there we argue exactly this. So this is the first step, the first requirement, and for the other requirements, I will leave Bjorn take the lead.
Thanks. Let's see. So you see my screen now?
Yes.
All right, thanks, Matteo. So I'll just go from here. So we think for the second requirement that any satisfactory theory of consciousness should be able to explain and ultimately predict the presence or absence of consciousness in a particular system in a state. So basically, here I've made a little drawing of, in certain situations, we have humans that experience something, for example, seeing a sunset. In other situations, we seem to at least not experience anything at all, which is probably better shown as not having a thought bubble at all there. We would also like to explain how and why some systems are conscious and others are not, or why one system is conscious in one particular state, like you in this particular state that you're in right now, but not in another one. For example, you tonight when you have dreamless sleep without any phenomenal content at all. And also, like Matteo mentioned earlier, why we need to be able to explain why consciousness is specified by the particular substrate that it is, and not another. We need to give some sort of principled explanation for what is called the full MCC in one of the later neural correlate papers. And an example of a type of prediction that needs to be possible, at least to make given a theory, is that given a patient in a particular state, you need to be able to at least give a principled prediction for whether or not that person is conscious. A third requirement is that we think any satisfactory theory needs to be able to explain and predict the contents of conscious experience. So here I've just made a cartoon drawing of the apparent fact that any given experience seems to have distinguishable components in a given moment. So one experience can have multiple different components here. For example, I can at the same time experience a visual scene while hearing music and seeing this part of the visual scene as an object, the sun in the distance. If I'm unlucky, I might have just stepped on something and have pain in the foot, and maybe I'm agonizing over the fact that this would have been such a beautiful experience had it not been for my foot. And all of these things can happen in a single unified experience. However, we need to be able to explain the fact that single experiences can have multiple contents. And also in the same, or similarly, we need to be able to explain why these individual contents seem to be more strongly related to some parts of the substrate that specifies the experience as a whole, and not others. So here I've again just drawn cartoon bubbles indicating that the visual scene is probably more specified by the back of the brain, object probably by the somewhere along the what pathway. Pain in the foot must at least involve something of the somatosensory cortex probably, and so on. These are of course not exhaustive or very scientifically valid probably, but at least there's an indication that different contents are probably specified by different parts of the substrate. Yeah, so in this point, different types of predictions that we feel a theory should be able to make is that given a patient, again, for example, in a particular state, using your theory, you should be able to answer the question, is this patient in pain? Or another person just sleeping this time, it should not only be able to say, is this person dreaming, but particularly, what is this person dreaming about? What's the content of this person's dream, if they are in fact dreaming? And also similar, or another type of related prediction is the theory should be able to say, if I go in and interrupt this particular region, for example, this green region here in the brain, how does that change the content of this particular subject's experience? So again, focusing in on the fact that different parts of the brain have specified different contents of experience. And then there is this issue of, or a fact, I think, that experiences can be dissociated from stimuli and behaviors. So, and we think, therefore, any theory needs to be behavior or independent of behavior or stimulus. That doesn't mean that behavior and stimulus are completely unrelated to the experiences that you're having, just that the explanation and predictions that the theory give cannot refer solely or rely solely on inputs and outputs to the physical system under investigation. So for example, you can't explain the fact that I see a red square only by referring to the fact that you are showing me or holding a red square in front of my eyes. And in the same vein, you can't infer or use as an explanation solely the fact that I say I'm seeing a red square. There needs to be something else in there. Yeah, so here's a little table just indicating or showing this this dissociation for phenomenology and then behavior in this case, that there are different ways you can have some phenomenology during wakefulness, for example. You also have behavior, but during some states of REM sleep, for example, you have next to no, at least advanced behavior. During sleep paralysis, also different types of catatonia. You can be paralyzed, but still, at least we think you have very vivid experiences. And then there is these cases of non-communicative patients, where in some situations it seems like they do have vivid phenomenology, but no behavior. On the other hand, you can also have these patients over here, where it turns out that our best guess is that they have no phenomenology, while they do have some behavior in this simple or reflex behavior, for example. Okay, but there are at least examples, I think, that where there is no or very little reason to believe that there is phenomenology while there is still behavior. And then, of course, you have situations where there is none of either, or at least we think so, during coma or death, or for a rock, for that matter. But we don't know that yet. Okay, so here's another maybe controversial requirement, that we think that theory needs to start from phenomenology and end with phenomenology. This may seem very radical, but I don't think it really is. So what we mean by this is that when you know,
Bjorn,
yep.
I think Matthias had a finger. Maybe he wants to interject right now instead of waiting.
Yeah, just I was just wondering whether in the no phenomenology category you would count an inactive set of logic gates.
In the previous one?
Yeah.
In the no?
Yeah.
Well, for now.
No, next to alpha 0.
Oh, up here? I honestly, I don't know.
Or even in the no, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. So I think we don't know alpha 0 either. I would personally need to look into the particular set of logic gates that you are providing me, but I wouldn't want to make any strong statements for or against, only provide an answer based on our best present theory of consciousness.
Also, maybe the criteria 6 and 7 are relevant for this, so
yeah,
we'll get there.
Yeah, so what we mean by this, we had a talk yesterday about starting from phenomenology and the problems that has or may have. But I think it's important when we create an explanation for consciousness, we need to in fact take into account the properties of the experience when we are creating our explanatory framework. And the explanation itself needs to actually refer back to some phenomenology. It can't just be an explanation that refers to, you know, behaviors or other brain states or other types of physical phenomena. And we think in order for a theory to be a theory of consciousness, it needs to actually explain the phenomenology. So requirement 6 is maybe not so much as a requirement for the theory as the methodology around it, and is that we would like for theories to be validated and tested first, at least in paradigmatic cases. And by what we mean by that is that to validate and test the theory, we need to start with situations in which we are fairly or as certain as we possibly can be that there is in fact phenomenology in the first place. So we suggest then consciousness in adult healthy human beings in natural settings, meaning no trickery involved, just, you know, a person that is awake and aware, in which we can be as confident as possible that we know as much as we can about the phenomenology that they have. That doesn't mean that the report is infallible. It just means that we can at least be as confident as we possibly can that their experience is what we think it is. So we have a little check mark here over the human with the sunset. Even though it may turn out that robots do in fact dream of electric sheep, we don't think you should validate or test a theory based on that. We'll come back to that later and when we generalize beyond, but for the validation phase, we think we should stick to as uncontroversial cases of presence and structure of consciousness as we can, and then we can talk more about whether we can talk about absence of consciousness. And then we think a requirement is that at least in principle, a theory must be applicable to systems beyond humans as well. So even though we should validate and test in the theory in situations where we are as confident as we can about the presence and structure of the theory, we think in order for it to be a theory about consciousness and not just about human consciousness, it needs to be applicable to other systems such as, well, infants. My daughter is in fact a human, but also to offer different animals, possibly machines or brain organoids or other things like logic gates that are all off for that matter. In this case, we don't know the ground truth of whether or not they are conscious. We have probably good intuitions and ideas about it, but we strictly don't know or we know even less about it than we know about the paradigmatic cases. But we need to be able to apply the theory in order to give a reasonable best guess or as good a guess as that we can based on the theory about what their experiences are. This is not where the validation of the theory happens, though. We think it's where generalizations and extrapolations happen. Now, of course, this was just the first attempt at a list, and we are asking here if there can only be one. We're assuming that many theories will pass these criteria. So what happens if more than one theory satisfies the requirements? Should we, make it more stringent so that we end up only with one in the end? Should we find differential predictions and adjudicate, or are we happy with having more than one good theory? Are we allowed to appeal to parsimony? Or should we just be happy that we have multiple frameworks to use to explain possibly the most important aspect of the natural world? I don't know, but at least here's our current list. A theory of consciousness is satisfactory if and only if, well, a double F is too strong, I think, Matteo, but maybe at least if for now. R1 is if the scientific theory must in fact be of conscious experience. R2 if it detects the presence and or absence of consciousness, if it can explain the contents of consciousness, if it's behavior and stimulus independent, starts from phenomenology and ends with phenomenology, can be validated and tested in paradigmatic cases, and is applicable beyond humans. This is our first attempt, and like Matteo said, and we'd be very happy to alter it and change it and get inputs and all of these things and discuss it further with you. So there are some basic questions for discussion. Are there any missing requirements? Any incorrect requirements in your view? Should we even search for or try to converge on such requirements? We don't really know, but would love to hear your inputs. So before we open for discussion, maybe is there anything I forgot to say, Matteo, that you would like to add?
No, I think that's it.
Okay, well, thank you for your attention, and yeah, let's discuss.